Have you ever tried to explain why you struggle and found yourself saying, "Nothing that bad really happened to me"? No single catastrophic event, no obvious abuse, no moment that you can point to and say, that is where it started. And yet something is clearly there. A nervous system that never quite settles, a body that carries tension it can't release, patterns that repeat across relationships, across years, across every attempt to change them. A chronic illness that doesn't respond the way it should to everything you've tried. If that is your experience, I want to offer you something today. Not a diagnosis, not a label, but a framework that may finally make sense of something you've been carrying without ever quite being able to name. Welcome back. I'm Madeleine Lowry, a neural retraining specialist. We are continuing our series on trauma, the nervous system, and chronic illness. In our last episode, we talked about hidden trauma, the experiences stored in the subconscious that the conscious mind has no access to, birth trauma, inherited patterns, pre-verbal experience. Today, we're talking about a different kind of trauma that is equally invisible, but for a different reason. Not because it happened before memory began, but because it didn't happen once. It happened continuously, woven into the fabric of daily life. So pervasive, so ordinary, so simply the way things were, that it never registered as trauma at all. This is complex trauma, and it is, in my experience, one of the most common and most under-recognized roots of chronic illness. Complex trauma is not defined by a single overwhelming event. It is defined by the cumulative impact of repeated, prolonged, or chronic adversity, particularly adversity that occurred within relationships, and particularly during the developmental years of childhood. It might look like growing up in a home where emotional safety was unpredictable, a parent whose moods were volatile or whose love felt conditional, an environment of chronic tension, conflict, or instability, consistent emotional dismissiveness, being told your feelings were wrong, too much, or irrelevant, growing up with a parent who struggled with depression, anxiety, addiction, or untreated mental illness, and absorbing the weight of that struggle without anyone acknowledging the impact on you. Chronic family stress, financial, relational, health-related, that created a background hum of anxiety that was simply always there. None of these experiences may have felt dramatic at the time. They were simply life, the environment you were born into, the water you swam in. But for the developing nervous system, especially a sensitive one, chronic exposure to these conditions is not simply stressful. It is shaping. It shapes the nervous system's baseline level of activation, its default assumptions about safety and danger, its fundamental sense of whether the world is a trustworthy place, and whether the self is worthy of care. Let's talk about what the ACEs study missed. In our first episode of this series, we talked about the ACEs study, its significant findings and its significant limitations. Complex trauma is where those limitations are most apparent. The ACEs study measured discrete events, abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, that could be counted and scored. But complex trauma is not discrete. It is atmospheric. It is the chronic emotional unavailability of a parent who is physically present but psychologically absent. The household where nothing was ever explicitly said, but everything was felt. The family where love existed, but so did a pervasive undercurrent of anxiety, shame, or unpredictability. that the sensitive child absorbed completely. These experiences don't score on a 10-item questionnaire, but they do leave a profound mark on the nervous system. In fact, many researchers and clinicians now believe that chronic relational and developmental adversity, the kind that complex trauma describes, may be more damaging to the developing nervous system than single-event trauma. Because it doesn't just create a traumatic memory, it creates a traumatic template, a fundamental way of experiencing the self, relationships, and the world that shapes everything that follows. Because complex trauma doesn't produce a single traumatic memory, its effects tend to show up not as flashbacks or nightmares, but as patterns. Patterns that can look from the outside like personality traits, or character flaws, or simply the way this person is. They might include a chronic difficulty with emotional regulation, feelings that go from 0 to overwhelming very quickly, or that are so suppressed they seem absent entirely. A persistent sense of shame or unworthiness that has no clear origin, but has simply always been there. Relationships that follow familiar and painful patterns, giving too much, receiving too little, feeling responsible for everyone else's emotional state. Hypervigilance that never fully turns off, a nervous system always slightly braced, always scanning for what might go wrong. Difficulty trusting others, oneself, or the possibility that things could be different. And critically for the listeners of this series, a body that has been living in a state of chronic stress activation for so long that physical symptoms have become part of the landscape. Fatigue that doesn't respond to rest, pain that moves or shifts or has no clear physical explanation, immune dysregulation, digestive issues, hormonal imbalance, a nervous system that simply cannot find its way to be settled. These are not signs of weakness. These are signs of a nervous system that has been shaped by chronic adversity and has never had the conditions it needed to fully regulate. I want to speak specifically to those of you who identify as highly sensitive, because complex trauma and sensitivity have a particularly significant relationship. As we explored in our earlier series, highly sensitive people process experience more deeply. They pick up on subtleties others miss. They feel other people's emotions as if they were their own. They are more affected by the emotional atmosphere of their environment. This means that a sensitive child in a home with chronic tension, unpredictability, or emotional unavailability is not simply exposed to that environment. They are saturated by it. The undercurrent of anxiety that another child may barely notice is, to the sensitive child, a constant and overwhelming presence. The paternal mood that others brush off lands on the sensitive child's nervous system as a full-body experience. And because sensitive children often don't have language for what they are experiencing, because no one around them may be naming it, they internalize it. They conclude not that the environment is dysregulating, but that something is wrong with them, that they are too much, too sensitive, too emotional, too reactive. And that conclusion, laid down in the most formative years of development, becomes one of the core beliefs that we will explore in a future episode. The connection between complex trauma and chronic illness is one of the clearest and most consistent patterns I see in my work. Not because every person with chronic illness has complex trauma, but because the nervous system effects of complex trauma, which are chronic activation, immune dysregulation, autonomic instability, are the same nervous system effects that underlie so many chronic conditions. And because complex trauma by its nature is rarely identified or treated, the person with a single traumatic event may eventually connect their symptoms to that event, may seek trauma-focused treatment, may have a framework for understanding why their nervous system behaves as it does. But the person with complex trauma often has no such framework. They don't have a traumatic event to point to. They just have a nervous system that has never quite worked the way it should, and a body that reflects that. And so they search for physical explanations for what is, at its root, a nervous system problem. They try treatments that address the symptoms without addressing the underlying dysregulation. And they wonder why nothing quite works. Understanding complex trauma, recognizing it as the real, significant, physiologically impactful experience it is often the first step toward a different kind of healing. Let's talk about what neural retraining offers. Complex trauma presents particular challenges for conventional therapeutic approaches because it isn't stored as a discrete memory that can be identified and processed. It is stored as a pattern, a pervasive way of being that is woven through the entire nervous system. Talk therapy can provide valuable insight into these patterns, but insight alone rarely dissolves them because they were never primarily intellectual. They were always neurological. Neural retraining works at the level where complex trauma is actually stored. In a session, we don't need to identify a specific traumatic memory. We work with the subconscious programming, the patterns, the negative beliefs, the chronic activations that complex trauma has laid down. As the subconscious mind begins to process and neutralize the charges associated with these patterns, something fundamental begins to shift. The chronic background activation quiets. The default sense of danger or unsafety begins to be replaced by something more settled. The nervous system, perhaps for the first time, begins to find its way to a genuine resting state. And as that happens, the body, which has been reflecting the nervous system's dysregulation for years or decades, begins to respond. Not because the past was changed, but because the nervous system is finally no longer living in it. If you have spent years telling yourself that you don't have trauma, that nothing bad enough happened to you, that you shouldn't still be affected by what was really just ordinary life, I want to offer you a different perspective. What you experienced was real. The impact on your nervous system was real. The chronic illness, the patterns, the persistent sense that something is simply not quite right, all of that is real. And it has a name, and it has a path forward. In our next episode, we're going to talk about something that many people find both validating and important. The trauma that comes from not what happened to you directly, but from what you witnessed, absorbed, or carried on behalf of someone you loved. The caregiver, the witness, the empath, the person who was always the strong one and who never received permission to acknowledge how much that cost. If you would like to learn more about this work in the meantime, please visit tcneuralretraining.com. Schedule a free consultation by phone or take our free quiz to see if neural retraining might be right for you. If this episode resonated with you, please follow the podcast, give it a positive rating, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for listening. Content of this podcast, copyright 2026, by Twin Cities Neural Retraining. Music by Barbara Ben.